use the Hijab 10 discount code for 10% discount on a wide range of products, including premium Ethiopian black seed products.
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to another episode of the MH podcast. I am joined with a spiritual guide, a very important YouTuber, Conor Murphy. How you doing, Conor?
I'm great, man. How are you?
Not bad. Conor Murphy got in contact with me through Instagram, and he was telling me that, he's been watching some of my material, and that he wants to explore some of the ideas about Islam and the concept of God and so on and so forth. So we want to get straight into it. You said that, in fact, in that message, you said that you find that the idea of God is in Islam is quite coherent or quite good, and you're convinced by it. Let's start with that. What is your idea of the Islamic understanding of God?
Okay. Yeah. And it might not be correct. Yeah. This is what I'm here. I'm here to understand your viewpoint for sure. Mm-hmm. But essentially what I'm understanding is that Islam has a very fundamental concept of God, rather than some complicated version of like a holy Trinity or something like that.
Yep.
There is one all-powerful being that's created the entire universe, right?
Yep.
And I think this is one of the reasons why Islam doesn't really use like symbols. Like in Christianity, we have the symbol of Jesus, right? And the symbol of like this man in the sky. But I like Islam because it does not portray God in any specific way, right? Because of course, if we did portray God in any specific way, God wouldn't be infinite and amorphous, and you know what I mean? So that's what I understand.
Yeah, and that's pretty good. That is exactly right. So, in terms of God, we don't believe in a person, human being is God. We don't believe that anyone with a date of birth can ever be an eternal God by definition. And obviously, as Muslims, we do believe in Jesus Christ. We believe in him as a prophet and a Messiah, as a human being, but not as a God. He's a human being, a prophet in the long line of prophets and messengers, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, all of whom came to tell people to worship in one God, or to believe in one God and worship him and do good deeds. So what is your general impression of the narrative that's being presented here, of all these prophets coming aforetime and dictating, as it were, the same kind of message?
Yeah. So I think all these prophets found God. They found God.
Yes.
Here's where I think it gets interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So I think these prophets knew God beyond the conceptual mind. So essentially the analogy that I like to use is that these prophets actually tasted the apple. Okay. So they experienced this apple, let's say. And the issue is that they experienced this apple, but now the apple is so great. It's the best fruit in the world. And no one else in the world knows what this apple is. And of course they can't make people experience the apple. It's not like they can bring the apple with them and give it to everyone else. So they start to try and explain this apple, right? And they explain it the best way that they can. They say, oh, it's red and juicy. It's the best fruit you'll ever have. It's kind of like an orange, but it's different. It tastes a little sweeter, blah, blah, blah. And now all these people, they start believing that that's what this apple is, right? But there is a big difference. There's a big distinguishment between thinking and conceptualizing the apple and actually knowing and experiencing what that apple is. And that's, I think, where we run into issues, is that all these prophets knew, they experienced God, right? They really knew God on the deepest cellular existential level. And then they go and try and explain God. And of course, people get the wrong idea because they've never experienced God. They're trying to conceptualize an infinite being with a finite human mind, and it's impossible to really do with the concept.
I get what you're saying. I'm not sure if you're aware, but in Islam there is a concept of the Fitra. Now, the Fitra is an innate predisposition, and so it's exactly what you're kind of describing here. I believe. I think there is a great intersection, at least, in what you're saying and what the Fitra is. So the Fitra is this idea that human beings, not just prophets, but all human beings, have in them this innate predisposition or receptivity to knowing there's a higher power. It's an innate receptivity. And it's not something which is demonstrable. It's not something which is necessarily logical, although it can be as well, right? It's
Right.
not something which you can describe through a human language necessarily. It is just an inclination. It is a feeling. It's a first-person subjective experience.
Mhm.
You could even call it a spiritual experience, but it's one that all human beings actually they have that experience, whether they know it or not. And in fact, in 2011, there was a study in Oxford University by Justin Barrett. And what was interesting is that he collected, this kind of data from children cross-culturally in different countries. And he found that one thing is the case, that wherever they have been socialized, that children have this receptivity to believing God. This is exactly the apple that I think you're just trying to describe here. Maybe not at the level of prophets, because obviously we do believe that potentially the kind of interaction prophets would have would be much more meaningful and deeper and stronger. But on an individual level, I think there is this propensity for human being to have this spiritual first-person subjective experience. What do you think?
Absolutely. Yeah. Dude, I love that you brought that up, because I was actually going to bring that up. I was watching one of your videos and you were talking about this innate belief in God that children would have. And I'm like, oh, that's so awesome, because that really puts atheism in a different perspective, right?
Yeah.
The atheists believe that the burden of proof is on us, right? When that is completely subjective. To me, it's like walking through a chocolate factory, right? I'm seeing the chocolate being made, the liquid flowing chocolate everywhere. And then you have an atheist who only knows what a chocolate bar is. So we're walking through this chocolate factory together, and I'm like, look at all the chocolate. And he's like, what do you mean? I don't see any chocolate. I'm like, dude, it's everywhere. He's like, no, like, prove it. I'm like, it's right here. It's everywhere, right? Mm-hmm. And he's like, no, I don't see any chocolate. Do some study. Show me the chocolate. I'm like, no, you don't understand. It's everywhere. I think that they need to prove that God doesn't exist, because I am experiencing God everywhere. You know what I mean? And so I think that's great. I think that's something that needs to be brought to light more, is this innate ability in children to believe in God. It's actually a very natural thing, right?
For sure. And I think with these kinds of discussions, it's important to have a robust definition of God, because for us, the Arabic word ilah literally means an object of worship, something which is worshipped. And then we go to another question: what is worship? Because depending on how we define that, then we'd be able to establish whether or not people or worship objects in the first place. So our understanding of worship is entire submission, or like being fully in submission to a thing, whether that be, it could be your body, it could be money, like it could be your own desires. So the Quran says, for example, أَفَرَأَيْتَ مَنِ اتَّخَذَ إِلَهَهُ هَوَاهُ. Have you seen the one who takes his own desires as his Lord? In other words, he sees that the moral apex of submission is to one's own pleasure and pain, for example, right? That they want to maximize pleasure and minimize pain. And that is basically the purpose of life. And however much you do that is how much you'll be coming closer to establishing your purpose. So from those perspectives, the thing which you worship is a god, right? And the Islamic claim, at least, especially it relates to atheists, is that they're not actually atheists in the first place, that they do have a set of beliefs, or they do have something which they would submit to, or it could be a variety of different things, whether it be the law, whether it be social expectations, whether it be spousal expectation, whether it be friendship groups whether it be their own desires, or a combination of all of those things. We would say that they are in fact fully submissive to all of those things, and therefore they're polytheists. They're just a sophisticated form of polytheist. They're not actually atheists at all. But that's really, it hinges on the definitions of God, and it hinges on the definition of worship. But yeah, for us, that would be the case. And so the Islamic understanding is that there's only one God worthy of worship. So that you have all of these different gods, but they are not worthy of worship, because they didn't create you, they're not sustaining you, they're not maintaining you, they are not the greater power that you had an intuitive inclination towards, and therefore they are not worthy of worship. What is in fact worthy of worship is the one who created you and is maintaining you, and all those things that I've just mentioned.
I like it. It's like we need to come up with a word. It's like a part theist. It's like they're worshiping like a part of God, but not God itself, right? Which is kind of silly. You know what I mean? It's like, why are you going to worship science? Because atheists do. They worship science. That's like a God to them. They think they put that on a pedestal, right? It's essentially worship. But yet, why worship that when that is just a part of something much bigger?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is the kind of understanding. So So like you said, especially new atheists, I wouldn't generalize all atheists, but definitely new atheists, you'll find that they actually even claim sometimes that science is omniscient and that it can kind of answer all things. But this is flawed on so many levels, because science just doesn't have the propensity or capacity or facilitation to be able to deal with why questions, to deal with metaphysics, to be able to deal with mathematics and morality and all morality. And so therefore science is entirely limited. And in fact, science is an enterprise, right? It's based on this principle of falsification. The whole idea of science is that we're trying to not only prove things, but disprove things as well. So science, in order for it to be so, it has to have the ability to being falsified. And so if you're, in a sense, putting all your hopes into the scientific enterprise, you haven't understood it, which is the irony of all ironies, really, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Any system that is self-reflective, right, that can self-reference, it has the ability to destroy itself. So if you can do science on science, it destroys it, right? Just like if you do logic on logic, it can destroy logic, right? Cadell proved this with Cadell's Incompleteness theorem, right? Essentially the statement, this statement is unprovable, right? Essentially you have a statement, and by definition, it is unprovable. And so therefore it's true, but you can't prove it with logic. And what that shows is that truth is beyond logic, right? And so there are these truths that are beyond any of these systems, right? The deepest truth is this, you can call it this intuition, this intuitive truth that is really beyond like even the conceptual mind. And that's what people don't realize, is that we're so trapped in this symbolic mind, these symbols, these concepts, right? We're mistaking the map for the territory, right? And so, yeah, I think that's something that people really need to understand, is that all these systems, they're great for understanding the content of reality, right? But not the context. That's something that science can't explain, is the context, right? Because think about this. If you're in a dream, right, you can do science in a dream. Even if the dream is different from reality, right, it still has science. You know what I mean? You can do science in a dream. In some dreams, it could have the same laws as reality, right? But what science will never tell you is that you're in the dream, right? Science can't tell you that. You can't do science in a dream to figure out that you're in the dream. You realize that you're in the dream by just intuitively, you become lucid in the dream. Something just sets off this trigger and you just realize through the mind, through kind of a deeper mind, that you're in the dream, right? And that's something that science can't do.
Yeah, and that's because science works on a third person level, and dreams and all these subjective experiences are all first person. And so the inability of science to interact with the first person is inbuilt within the system. If it was first person, it would be subjective and therefore would lose its veracity as a scientific method, as it were. But in terms of, now this was something that you kind of hinted at in the beginning of the discussion, which is the idea of not knowing God, or not being able to know God fully. And yeah, if you look at, for example, the Quran, there's lots of attributes of God, names and attributes of God, right? But having said that, there are some principles which override our own our understanding or interaction with those attributes. And it's actually a verse in the Quran, which is لَيْسَ كَمِثْلِهِ شَيْءٌ وَهُوَ السَّمِيعُ الْبَصِيرُ, that chapter 42, verse 11, which says that there's nothing like him at all, and that he is all seeing, all hearing. So in other words, when we're, for example, as an example, introduced to the name of God, or one of the attributes of God, that he's the most merciful, or that he's the king, for example. Now, one of the names of God in the Islamic corpus is that he's the king. But obviously now, if we take this word king, Malik, in the Arabic language, or Malach in the Hebrew language, if we take this word king, really, when we apply it on a human level in the world that we live in now, obviously it denotes masculinity, for example. Yeah, for example, because a king is not a queen. So you were thinking about a man. And obviously we know that God is not a man or a woman. So that aspect of describing God is definitely not concurrent with it. So this, I think, was kind of touching upon what you were saying in the beginning, that human language, whatever language it may be, is always going to be limited to being able to describe God, because of the magnificence of God, or the grandiosity of God. And therefore, human language is always going to be limited. That's why it's important to, even when we're, as Muslims, when we're kind of reciting the Quran and going over the names and attributes of God, to realize that these names and attributes, despite how beautiful they are, they don't do justice. They don't do full justice to the magnanimity or the grandiosity of God Almighty, which you say with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or God Almighty. So I do agree with you on that. For us, we do have descriptions of God, but they do not do justice to the entirety of God or the essence of God or anything like that. And this is even the case when because in Islamic parlance, we do have like heaven and hell, for example. We believe in heaven and hell. We believe in, the day of judgment. We believe when human beings die, that it's not just going to be that they turn into rubble and dust and bone, that there will be kind of like another reckoning, that they'll be resurrected and that they'll be judged on the day of judgment, depending on what kind of deeds they did, what kind of belief they had, if they were introduced to the truth and were they receptive to the truth, or not, and so on and so forth. And then we do believe in heaven and we do believe in hell. And so, for example, this afterlife space, we although there's lots, it's vivid and description in the Quran and the Hadith about God and the gardens and the hellfire and its torments and so on. The Prophet said something quite interesting about this. He says that it's ma khatara ala qalbi bashar, that even though all of these descriptions are there, no one has actually experienced it with their heart, all of those things. So these descriptions are all there, but they will not be sufficient in being able to make you experience those realities. And likewise, even though all the descriptions are there about God, and they're correct descriptions and true, we would say that some of them are not applicable because laysa kamithlihi shay, there's nothing like him. So for example, God is not a man, and a king is a man in the world that we live in, and so on. So from those perspectives, I don't disagree with the point that you were making in the beginning of the podcast, that although we do have all these descriptions, it really is an experiential thing.
Right. I love it. And I love how you said how you can't really put a definition on God. I mean, you can try, but it will always be an abstraction.
Yeah.
Right. So I like to think of God as analogous to a mirror, right? On a much more grandiose scale, but we can think of a mirror, right? The essence of a mirror is that it essentially has no properties other than being reflexive, right? So this is the issue. If the mirror had any properties whatsoever, such as being red, right? Or being, only reflecting big things, only reflecting small things, then it would be limited in that sense that you couldn't put something in the mirror and, create that image, right? If it was red, then everything in the mirror would be red. It wouldn't serve its purpose, right? And its purpose is to simply reflect all else that there is, right? So I kind of like to think of God as this infinite mirror, right? Mirrors are still limited because they're in the physical space, in space and time, right?
Yeah.
So God is almost like this infinite mirror, this infinite singularity of reflexiveness, if that makes sense. And still that's an abstraction, because anything that uses language is an abstraction. Now, God, I mean, of course you would say that God's essence is essentially, absolute infinity, right? God is boundless, limitless, right? And just by the nature of experience itself, right? Experience must be finite, right? You can't experience everything at once, or that would take away from the essence of experience. So you can't experience this absolute infinity that God is. And of course, even these prophets, right? There's no way they experience absolute infinity, right? But I believe that they can experience maybe some sort of lower level infinity, right? There are different levels of infinity, right? There's an infinite amount of numbers between 1 and 2, but there's a greater amount of numbers between 1 and 100, right? If you count all the decimal places, right? And so I think that the human mind is actually capable of having some tremendous, incredible mystical experiences of certain levels of infinity, but not ever the greatest, the absolute, right? And I think the absolute can really only be known in the relative. But I think there's still something to be found there that can be kind of known on a deeper experiential level.
Yeah, I a lot of what you said resonates with me. I think there would be one thing where we obviously, as Muslims, the traditional kind of normative narrative would disagree with, is the fact that, okay, so we differentiate between parts and attributes, right? So for example, what causes limitation? That something is composed of parts and is subject to dissembly, can be broken up and can be rearranged. This is an indication of finitude, right? Because it's something which is limited in its variables, and anything that fits that profile cannot be God by definition. So it cannot be the maximal, it cannot be the infinite, it cannot be the limitless. It has to be limited by extension, therefore. But we would say that there is a subtle and very important difference between those parts and attributes. So, for instance, when we use the word infinity, it sometimes loses its meaning unless we attach to it kind of like an adjective afterwards. So infinitely what? So if we're talking about infinitely powerful, are we talking about infinitely loving? Are we talking about infinitely merciful? And so in many ways, what's required in order to give value, if you want, any type of value, or make sense of any kind of sense to this thing that we would like to call God for the sake of argument, is that we attach adjectives. Now, so for example, we say God is infinite. That's already kind of like an adjective, but when someone probes and says, well, what is this God infinite in? We would come back and say, well, he's infinite in power, for example, or he's infinite in mercy, or he's infinite in love, or whatever it is you want to put as an adjective there. Some things we would be able to kind of extrapolate logically, and other things would be textually. For example, like love, I would argue that it's not something that's logically intuitive or demonstrable. Something either you experience from first person subjective experience or through some kind of a text. And obviously from our perspective, obviously Jews and Christians as well, they believe that God is love. We all believe that God is love. That's something that's concurrent within all three so-called Abrahamic religions. So it's important when you say that God is infinite, in order to make sense of the sentence, that we attach kind of like an adjective there. And that essentially becomes the attribute of God, not a property in the sense that can be pulled apart and dissembled and so on, but it's something which makes sense of this concept of God. Otherwise, it becomes almost a meaningless concept. It becomes something which is, a figment of one's imagination, or it does unfortunately become an abstraction of some sorts. So for us, we would, in order to make sense of the concept, we would say, yeah, God is infinite, but in what? So for instance, power is one thing. Knowledge is another thing, omniscience, omnipotence, all the omni qualities and so on.
I like it. Interesting. What about infinitely infinite?
Yeah, that's just tautology, right? So that would be, that's just a tautology. So in logic, that would just be like saying it's raining and it's raining.
Right. And this is
it's a true statement. It's always
right.
true. Tautology is always true, but it's just kind of like superfluous in terms of
right. Well, and that's the issue, is because we're trying to explain this being that's beyond logic with logic, and that's why it's so difficult, right? That's why it's
exactly. Yeah.
Right? But yeah, interesting, man. I like it. So it's really difficult though, because this is the issue when you try and explain it with logic, is that you'll kind of run into these contradictions, right? And a lot of people, we live in this logical, rational world where there are these contradictions and people think it's wrong, but contradictions are only wrong in the realm of logic, right? And systems, because God, of course, must transcend that. God and reality in general seems to me like this giant paradox and this contradiction that actually exists, right? So, for example, here's an interesting paradox, right? So, if you would probably say that God is, we'll use the attribute you call it, right? Infinitely, let's call God infinitely knowledgeable, right? So he has infinite knowledge, right?
Yeah.
So all knowing, and not him, it's whatever God is, right? Infinite knowledge, right? But if God has infinite knowledge, then God has limited power. Because if God has infinite knowledge, that means that God could not learn, right? That's interesting, right? And so what is it then?
Why would that limit his power?
To learn, right? Because if you know it,
right. Okay. I get the question. So right.
Yeah.
So this is a question that I think it's an interesting question. It's actually been put forward in the theology type questions, like can God lie? It's not just learn. Can God learn? Can God lie? Can God steal? Can God, like, there's a lot of things that can God do. The Quran never says God can do everything. I mean, this is not what the paradigm is. The Quran actually says, and this is the Islamic understanding, that Allah ala kulli shay'in qadir, that he's over all things powerful. And I'll tell you what the subtle difference is. In logic, in terms of categories, there's three major categories, all right? There's the impossible existences and the contingent or possible existences and the necessary existences. So an impossible existence is something which is a contradiction in terms, like a squared circle. So we just mentioned, like, contradictions do exist in the real world that we're in, or at least through the systems that we're thinking through, like logic and mathematics and whatever. So a squared circle is not actually a thing, right?
Right.
So because a squared circle cannot instantiate itself in the real world.
Right.
And so we would say things that are impossibilities are not things at all. Although they can be elaborated upon through language, they're not things at all. So, for example, the idea of a learning God is an impossibility, because it's the same thing as saying, for example, that you have an all-knowing, ignorant person. So if we only need to learn, or learning is only possible for the ignorant. And so if you're all-knowing ignorant, then it's a contradiction. So it's just like saying, can God create a rock so heavy that he can't lift? But that's a contradiction in terms, because if we're saying God can lift all the rocks, then him creating such a rock that he can't lift would mean that he's limited and unlimited at the same time. So it's essentially asking, can God be unlimited? Can God be limited and unlimited at the same time? And we would say no. The answer is a flat no, because the question itself would presuppose a contradiction in terms. Likewise, if someone said, can God steal? Well, if we say, look, God steal, well, how can God steal when he owns everything? So that would be a contradiction in terms. So you see, the idea of a learning God doesn't diminish from the power of God, but in fact, it actually affirms his power, if you think about it.
Right. I get what you're saying. But here's the thing, is that we're saying these contradictions can't be true. But of course, we're thinking in systems and logic, right?
Yeah.
I believe that God is so powerful that there's a way for both of these to be true at the same time. This is kind of the idea of non-duality, right? So God can both be unlimited and limited. And in fact, God is so powerful that it finds a way to do this, right? So God is so powerful that it can put itself in ignorance, right? And this is kind of the idea, if you think of the difference between a subconscious mind and a conscious mind, God could be consciously ignorant, but subconsciously all-knowing. Right? So God gets to kind of experience this ignorance, but deep down never loses its knowledge.
I get what you're saying. And this is kind of, it's quite similar to what I know you don't associate with it, but a lot of Trinitarians kind of use this line of reasoning when they're trying, for example, in the Bible, where it says that Jesus, he kind of looked at this tree and it was out of date and the figs were not, so he cursed the tree. And so and it says in the Bible also that, he doesn't know, no one knows when the hour is going to be except for the Father. And so to put themselves out of this misery, they usually have, there are three major, there's economic models, there's social models, and there's psychological models of the so-called Trinity, right? So what you're actually describing is in the literature, it's referred to as psychological models of the Trinity. So it's kind of like you've got one individual and that he's got these relationships within himself, like a multiple personality disorder. Some scholars have actually said like a multiple personality disorder, right? You said subconscious mind. In psychoanalytics, it's actually referred to as the unconscious mind. Subconscious thing is a colloquial term that some laymen have just invented. Actually, Freud would use the term unconscious. And so it's kind of similar to what the psychological models of the Trinity. The truth of the matter is, once again, it is actually putting forward contradictions. And in terms of the whole idea of can God allow contradictions to exist, which is a very interesting question. And I actually thought about this question quite a lot. We would say that God, everything that emanates in the real world is emanated from God. So what God is, from the Islamic perspective, is God is al-haq, he's the truth. And he's also one. We believe that he's one in essence, right? He's not zero, because that would mean that there's nothing there. And he's not more than one, because then that would suggest that there's kind of polytheism. So if God is one, in a sense, all systems of mathematics derive from that unity of God. And if God is the truth, all systems of logic derive from that system of reality and truth. And so God emanates those things. And so logic is just a derivative of the expression of God's truth. So logic from this perspective of mathematics, so anything that we see as hard truth in the universe is explainable through the prism or the paradigm of God, not despite it. So it doesn't exist in a mutually exclusive world. It exists as a result of God's will, for instance, right?
Yeah.
So, having said that, going back to the point of limit and experiencing ignorance, like I said, there are things that if God does, he stops being God by definition. And that's why it's important to have a robust definition of God. Now, we talked about an object of worship. But there's another thing that should be understood here, that God is, if we're saying that he's ultimately all powerful, all knowledgeable, and all these things, then his cessation to being any of those things at any time logically entails his cessation of being God. For instance, can God be a man? The question of can God be a man? Christians would answer yes, and obviously that's instantiated through Jesus Christ. We would say that would necessitate a contradiction in terms, which is that you have this unlimited entity that has to become limited, and therefore has to suspend his necessary attribute of being unlimited. And if you suspend it at any point, or if it's suspendable, then it was never necessary by definition. It must have been contingent. Because if it was necessary, the definition of something which is necessary is something which can never be any other way at any time. It's eternally necessary. And so this idea of the ignorance of God, or that God can steal, because you could actually go to lengths with this one. You could say, can God rape? Can God steal? Can God... now you can start bringing in lying. Can God do this? And the answer would be, how could a all true entity lie? How that would go against his ability of being all the truth? Do you see the idea there?
Yeah, I think there's a difference between relative truth and absolute truth.
Yeah.
But how you said how, like, say logic, the system of logic is a derivative of God, right? So in some way reflects God, right? But here's the thing about logic.
We would say it reflects his will more so.
Right. Yeah. It reflects God's will.
Yeah.
So here's the interesting thing. We've known that through Cadell's incompleteness theorem, that logic essentially shows limitations of itself.
Yeah.
So it's essentially God showing that there is truth beyond logic, right? So I just be careful not to put logic on this pedestal, right?
Yeah, I'm with you on that. Yeah,
it's tough because that's how modern society debates and talks about things, and that's right. That's
I mean, with Gödel's incompleteness theorem, I mean, bear in mind he had two models that he submitted. One of them, I think, in the 30s, and then he had another one. And what he was doing is, I think you kind of described it in a good way, like the paradox of the liar's paradox, basically the liar's paradox. But really what he was doing was he's applying that to mathematics through set theory, and saying that if you've got all these things in a set, then this is the set part of the set and not part of the set at the same time. So it's kind of like a paradox, right?
Right.
But that doesn't mean, I mean, I don't think from that people have decided that mathematics is not as untrue. It just means, what it means is that mathematics, just like logic, underpinning it are these axioms, which are basically there is no way of proving those axioms. By definition, a theorem and an axiom, or an axiom in particular, is something which cannot be proven. So AB equals BA, in mathematics, it's not something you can prove or I can prove. It's just an axiom. It has to be the way it is because it is. And on an atheistic paradigm, quite interestingly, there's no explanation for this, actually. You can't even explain why we have rational faculties, or why logic exists in the first place, or how we can have an interactivity with logical mathematics. But from the theist paradigm, there is an explanation. Is that these axioms have been put in place by an all-knowing, instantiator, if you like, or determinator, or whatever you want to call, or a lawmaker. And so from that angle, I think what Gödel was instrumental in showing in his time, and he was definitely one of the biggest names in the 20th century in terms of philosophy, was that there are these axioms which you cannot prove. The buck stops at certain axioms, and it becomes impossible to prove further than that. But I don't think what he showed is that mathematics is, as I think it's a common misconception, that mathematics is totally contradictory to itself.
Right. I mean, right. I wouldn't necessarily say it's contradictory to itself. I guess I would just say that it's limited. For example, for mathematics to even exist, you have to have this concept of an object, right? To add 1 and 1. Well, what are those two things that you're adding?
Yes.
Well, those are these objects. And I believe that there is a reality beyond even objects, right? And of course, God predates all objects. God gave rise to these objects, right? So trying to describe God in like a mathematical sense, it's almost like trying to describe math with physics, right? You actually need math for physics to even exist. So how can you explain math with physics, right? You can't explain like a higher level system with a lower level system. And that's why it's really impossible, because God is the highest system, to explain God with any language, any system, any words, anything.
Yeah, everything will be limited, right? So
Right.
this is why I think there's I don't think we're talking cross purposes. I think we both understand what we're talking, like what the other person is saying. But this is what I would say, right? It's possible to describe God, but whatever description you have is going to be limited. So it is possible that we can conceptualize God, but we can't fully encompass what God is in essence. We can't say that, oh, God is, and then any language will do justice to the attributes of God. So I totally agree with that. But having said this, what is required of human being is not to fully, from the Islamic paradigm, is not to fully encapsulate or encompass what it is to be God, or what God is like. It's more so to conceptualize him on an abstract level so that you can have some kind of relationship with him in your life. Right. And that's basically the point of Islam. So going back to the meta narrative, Islam is basically saying that you have all these prophets and messengers, Abraham, Moses, Jesus, that you've heard of in Sunday school or whatever it may be, and that you've done in the Western experience, Moses and so on. And then we say that Prophet Muhammad came with the final message for all humankind, whereas all those kind of other prophets were kind of localized to their people and times. We believe that the Prophet Muhammad was for all peoples and all times. And that, like every prophet, we believe that not only do they come with, they don't just come with the message, which is to believe in one God and worship in one God. This experience that you've had, this innate, intuitive experience that you've had, that you reconnect with it and know your purpose, which is to submit to this higher power. But not only this, but this messenger comes with a set of proofs and evidences to make them credible in their communities. And it's usually something which the community is very aware of, and can be actually tested. So from the Islamic perspective, we believe that Prophet Muhammad, not only he came with the Quran, which is, we obviously believe is the greatest miracle, but there was a set of miracles within the Quran and outside of it also that substantiated his prophethood or gave him credence or gave him some kind of credibility. And so if someone who comes now, like yourself or anybody else, who's investigating Islam as a coherent way of life and potentially a way to live your life, that it wouldn't just be this narrative that I'd be telling you now. It would be, actually, we've got a set of proofs which we believe we can put forward to you, which will go further by way of convincing you that Islam is true.
Right. I mean, yeah, I think the goal, what Islam is attempting to do, they're doing it very well. In fact, probably better than any other religion, to be honest. It's not very flawed at all in terms of, logic and rationality, right? But I do believe that there is a way to know God, not completely, right? This is the idea of absolute infinity, is that it can never be fully known, right? I think this is actually the beauty of reality, is that, because think about it. Think if you really knew God, like completely, somehow, 100%. Well, then what left is there, right? That kind of suck, right? To me, reality is, it's a flawed perfection, right? Again, another paradox. But the point is that it's this journey of knowing, right? So you can know God more and more and more and more and more, but because God is absolutely infinite, it takes infinite time to fully know God. And I think that's the beauty of it, right? I would just say that abstractions such as concepts, right, are limited in the sense of knowing God. And a lot of people think that is just the straight up limit. I believe that there are ways to go beyond that, right? To experience what prophets have experienced, right? Because it seems like these prophets have gone beyond the conceptual mind, right? To me, I believe that these prophets were simply human beings, right? They weren't this absolute infinity necessarily like in human form as we would think about it from a dualistic theist mind, but they were normal humans who just discovered on a deep level what God was, right? And I don't think that they needed any sort of religion to actually do it, because of course God is within, and they found that within themselves. Does that make sense? That's kind of
Yeah,
where
I
I'm
mean,
going.
there's a lot that I agree with, like in terms of prophets having this they intuit God and so on and so forth, and they experience God, and that we can't. A lot of the things that we can't fully understand God. I mean, I completely agree with those things. The one thing that we would say is that prophets, the thing that distinguishes prophets from the rest of human beings is the fact that God communicated with them directly. That
Right.
he spoke to them through some kind of intermediary. So in the case of the majority of prophets, it would be the angel Gabriel in the Islamic narrative. So the angel Gabriel would come as an angel who takes different forms. He came and communicated, literally communicated through human language with prophets, and it was an experience that they went through. So, for example, the Prophet Muhammad, the story goes, he went to a cave called Ghar Hira, which was a cave that's still there now. You can see in Mecca and in Saudi Arabia. And he was meditating, like, he
Right.
had a meditative temperament. He used to go and basically pack some food, go up to the cave, and just basically reflect on God. I mean, this the story went, and all of a sudden he was seized by this angel. He
Right.
had these kind of experiences with this angel that would then say to him, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq." Literally, at first, actually, he said "Iqra," which is read, and the Prophet Muhammad was illiterate, so he was unlettered. He couldn't read because that was the social milieu of the time, was a kind of unlettered milieu for the most part in the Arab desert at that time in the 7th century. So he said, "Ma ana biqari'in," I can't actually read. So he said again, "Iqra," read, and then he said, "Ma ana biqari'in," and he said for the third time, read. And then the Prophet said, "I can't read." And so then what we believe is the first verses of the Quran were revealed to the Prophet, which is, read in the name of your Lord who created human being from a clot. Read Iqra, the one who created human being from a clot, and the one who taught him by the pen. So two things that came down in, we believe, the first revelation, which was that God created human beings from a clot, alaqa or alaqa, and then after that he taught him with the pen. So this was the first interaction. The Prophet, then the story goes, he went to his wife, which was Khadija. She was actually his boss as well. Funny enough, she was his. He used to work in trade and business. So he went to his wife, and he explained to her what happened, this frightening experience that he kind of just went through. And she said, "Don't worry, God wouldn't," because they had the idea of God in the time, because of the previous dispensations, Judaism and Christianity and the Abrahamic religions. So she said, "God wouldn't punish you because you do good with the orphans. You're a charitable person and you're a good person. You're known in the community for this and that." And she covered him. He said, "Zambilini." He was shivering and so on. And so she covered him. She covered him with blankets. And this was the beginning of revelation. And we believe that this took place for 23 years, piecemeal, that bit by bit, the angel kept revisiting the Prophet, giving him more and more kind of verses to recite from the Quran and so on, until we had the totality of the Quran, which is now 6,236 odd verses, or 600 pages, or 70,000 words, or whatever it may be. And that is the guidance for humankind in terms of how to live and what to do in your life and so on. So basically, the idea of prophethood in Islam is the idea that an angel, literally, or that God communicates to you through an angel so that you can give guidance to human beings, to your community. And with the Prophet Muhammad, obviously, because we believe he was the final prophet, we believe that he was sent for all human beings. We haven't sent you except for all of humankind. And the Prophet said in his final speech, there's no virtue of a black person over a white person, or a white person over a black person, or an Arab over a non-Arab, or a non-Arab over an Arab, except through virtue, through good deeds and God consciousness. And so the whole idea really is a universal message, which is saying that this is a blueprint for how to live your life. And I think this where a lot of Western people, especially because of kind of like the Cultural Revolution in the 60s and after that, where irreligiosity became quite widespread and liberalism became widespread. This is where a lot of people start tuning off, because they start thinking to themselves, I don't want to live my life based on organized religion. But we believe it's actually quite liberating to do so, because when you live your life through the guidance of God, you're submitting yourself to God in the most practical way possible. It's not just a spiritual exercise or a meditation that you do or something like that. It's actually a physical thing, how you interact, how you even clean yourself. I mean, it has such detailed kind of guidance that we believe it's a practical way that God has given us for how to deal with life on a daily basis.
I like it. Yeah, there's this sense of submission that is very, very powerful. It's interesting. Everyone kind of wants to be in control, and the Western world is plagued by this want for power, right? This want for control. But what people don't realize is that we actually don't want control on the deepest level. Why? Because as humans, we're imperfect beings, right? And if we're all in control all the time, well, that's where chaos leads to, because we have these imperfect minds, right? But of course, submission to this higher power and the allowance of this higher power to control us, this higher power that is perfection,
yes,
obviously our lives are going to be much better, right? And yeah, I like that a lot for sure. I have an interesting question though. So when we talk about angels, right? Yes. What exactly is an angel, right? Because I also think that it's kind of dangerous to try and define what this angel is, because this angel is probably something that is also beyond logic and rationality as well, right? Yeah. It could be beyond all these systems of language that we're talking about. So I think it's also, people have to be wary of having this image of this angel in their mind, right? This image of this physical angel, like someone in a Halloween costume that's flying down and doing some magic trick. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
I think that this angel is a real thing, right? Yes. But I think it's dangerous to try and understand that with a conceptual mind, just like it's dangerous to attempt to define God, right? Would you agree?
Could say that. I mean, it's at the end of the day, it's a metaphysical construct. We believe that the angels were created from light. We believe that God created these angels, and that there are these creatures that live with us. Really, that they are part of the metaphysic of reality. And it's really interesting, because just because something is metaphysical doesn't mean that sometimes it can't be physical. So in the Islamic tradition, there is an idea that the angel can take human form as well. So the angel would come in human form sometimes to the Prophet and to the companions and speak to them. If not, it would come in a different form. So the angel can come from the Islamic perspective in different forms. And the purpose of the angel is that they basically have different functions. They are part of the system of the universe. They are invisible, you cannot see them, but they are part of the system of the universe. So they have different functionalities. For example, there's an angel that is discharged with particularly one job, which is to the ensoulment of the embryo. For example, there's another angel which ironically takes away your life, it takes away your soul. And the soul is something, once again, which is we cannot put our finger on it. We don't know where it is or what it is. And in fact, the Quran says this. I mean, it says, يَسْأَلُونَكَ عَنِ الرُّوحِ قُلْ الرُّوحُ مِنْ أَمْرِ رَبِّي. They ask you about the soul. Say the soul is from the affairs of the Lord. And we don't know much about it. Like what you're saying. We don't know. And you will not know much about it, because once again, it's metaphysical, right? So we cannot put it under a microscope and do experiments on it in that sense.
Right.
And so from those angles, I totally agree. I mean, the metaphysical world is the metaphysical world, right? Islam doesn't it doesn't judge people for not being able to conceptualize these things. Islam judges people for their ability to believe in those things. Like you're rewarded for believing in the fact that there are angels and that there's a God that you can't see and that there is a soul that you can't see, and that and so on. And in fact, that's one of the first things that I mentioned in the Quran. الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون. That ذلك الكتاب لا ريب فيه. This book has no doubt in it. هدى للمتقين. That it's a guidance for those who are pious. الذين يؤمنون بالغيب. The ones who they believe in the unseen. ويقيمون الصلاة, and they do their prayers. ومما رزقناهم ينفقون, and they are charitable with the monies that we provide for them. So the idea of these things metaphysically, a lot of people are kind of put off by them because they feel like it's legend or myth or fairy tale or all these things. But the truth of the matter is, there's lots of things, even in the world of science that we live in, which we can't see. Gravity is a force, but we don't see it. At the end of the day, gravity, we only know it through its effect. We have never seen gravity, but we
Right.
all acknowledge it and we all believe in it.
Mhm.
You know, and if it's true that we can believe in something through just the effect of it, and there's almost consensus in the scientific community, but no one has seen this gravity. No one has seen it. No one has put it under a microscope. Then the idea of believing in a God who created the universe and having the same kind of reasoning from cause to effect is not something which is delusional, as many new atheists would like us to believe. And we would say also, by extension, all of those other metaphysical things, once again, if you've already shown a propensity to be able to believe something you cannot empirically see, which is, for example, gravity, then it's not really that much of a leap of faith to believe in, for example, angels and demons and heaven and hell and God and all those things.
Right. No, absolutely. Right. I guess, to me, again, impossible to really conceptualize what an angel is unless you experience it, I guess.
Yeah.
But I would say that essentially, I mean, everything is God, right? So essentially, this angel is a fragment of God, right, for a specific purpose, right? And essentially, I guess that would be say Muhammad would be as well. And it's so kind of all these fragments kind of coming together into one, right? That's kind
I
of
get what you're saying. So this is something that obviously we don't believe in. Okay, we don't believe that God is everywhere in that sense. In his essence, we don't believe that God is everywhere in his essence, such that all of us are gods, or that we have an element of God. We believe that if this was the case, this would limit God. Going back to the question of limitation, because if this was the case, then our limitations would translate over to God's limitations. But in fact, God is transcendental in terms of his imposition or his interaction with creation. Okay, so in essence, God is transcendental. However, in terms of attributes, there is this idea in Islam of ma'iyah, or being with God. So the being with God is through his attributes and through his through connection with him. So even speaking to God, this is munajat. It's actually a system in Islam of speaking to him, or dua, or supplication, or even glorifying him or supplicating him. So these are all systems of interactivity where you can actually speak to God and have we don't believe this aloof kind of God, a deistic God that just creates everything and then just goes, so goodbye, I'm not going to have any interaction with anybody.
Right, of course.
This one of my friends, he recently said something interesting. He said that it's like this father that leaves the house or something like that,
Right.
We don't believe a God that, created everything and says, I'm just going to leave now because I'm not interested. We believe in a personal God. We do believe in a God that has an interaction, a meaningful interaction with human beings, but not that in his essence, just like you said, we can't even conceptualize God fully. So let alone to say that, my physical flesh is an instantiation of God, or my physical eyes and head and all that stuff. So God is not something which you can physically touch like this. We believe that he's transcendental, that he's above and beyond in his essence, the kind of scientific method, if you like.
I see. I guess my argument would be that if God could not be physical, if God could not have a human existence, that would make God limited.
Yeah,
right?
As I've said before, like, with these things, like, it depends on how we define what limitation is, right? So if we say that limitation is God is all powerful. So limitation in this context would be if he cannot instantiate that power, if there's a deficiency in his power, if he loses power or becomes weak or any of those things. God is always there. In other words, he's pre-eternal, he's post-eternal. So a limitation would be, for instance, that he's born, because this would mean that he is no longer eternal. He's somehow has a date of birth. Any person that you can point to and say this person has a date of birth, we would say this cannot be God, because this person has a date of birth, whereas God does not have a date of birth, and so on and so forth. And with this idea as well. So remember, we're dealing with necessary attributes that, had they been any other way, or would they be any other way, this would crumble the idea of God in front of our faces. The idea of God would no longer be tenable, because then it would just be something that is changing, a mutable or corrigible creature,
right?
Or entity. Yeah.
Right. Now, of course, God is so powerful and so indescribable. What if it was possible for God to be both physical and unphysical, to be born, but also eternal, right? To be mortal, but also immortal. What if God was that powerful where he could go beyond logic and rationality and actually be all of those things at once, right?
What if I could be here and not be here at the same time?
What if you are?
You know,
what
if
that's true?
Yeah, you know, that kind of thing. If I said to you, I'm not here, or you're not speaking to me, what would that, in your mind, what would you say? What would you think if I said that to you?
I would say that's
I'm not speaking to you right now. I'm not saying anything.
Right. I would say that's true. I would say that you don't exist nor not exist, right?
No, but the idea is that, just like Gödel showed, right, with the live paradox, it's like, it's not even like that. It's because in this case, if I say I'm not here, that would be a contradiction in terms, right?
Yeah, within the realm of logic.
Yes, of course.
From an existential nature, it wouldn't be, right? I mean, God created everything, right? But you could say that your existence right now maybe isn't as real as God, right? Because it's a creation of God. It's some sort of abstraction from God, because you are not God, right? You're saying that, right? So in a sense, you would be living in a more illusory world than God is, right? So in the sense that this world would be some sort of illusion, yet, of course, it's extremely real to you. So there's this duality between reality and illusion that can collapse, right? And it's neither real nor not real. I think when you go deep enough, you'll find that everything about reality, it's either that nor not that. That's what I'm talking about. Reality is this giant paradox. It is this giant contradiction. We're just uncomfortable with contradictions because we're in the realm of logic, right? So reality isn't even infinite nor not infinite, right? It's black nor white, right? It's this singularity of grayscale, right? And I think that's the issue, is that everyone is thinking in this black and white. This is how we've been raised to think since we were kids. And it's so difficult to snap out of the conceptual mind. But I think that it's possible to have these two sides of the dualities collapse into one. But this can't be done with the conceptual mind, because the conceptual mind can only think in dualities. So it has to be a deeper intuition. It's seeing the context, not the content. It's kind of like this reading in between the lines that is completely ineffable, right? It's like trying to talk to a blind man about what color is, right? Of course, a blind man could never know. It's telling someone who's never eaten an apple what an apple tastes like, right? Yep. I think that's the idea. But from my experience, reality doesn't have to be one side of the duality or the other. It can be both and neither at the same time. It's just something impossible to conceptualize. But then again, we know that God is impossible to conceptualize.
Yeah, I understand what you're saying, but the issue is that if we eliminate logic from the conversation, then everything becomes impossible to elaborate. So if I say, for example, if I say, look, I don't want to make a logical argument because it's possible that we can speak outside of the realms of logic. In other words, we can make sense. We can cohere, if you like,
right?
Even without the rules of logic being in the. But then, if we make that argument, we'll be making a logical argument. Do you see the point? So it's kind of inescapable, and it's so inescapable that it's grammar and logic are two best friends. Grammar and logic are, in fact, the two sides to the same coin. Because if you want to speak in any language, not just English, but in any language, there is a systemized, set of conventions that we're speaking with.
Right.
And if we really believe that logic is not important or should not feature in a conversation, or that we can live without it, whatever, grammar would crumble, civilization would crumble, communication would crumble, and almost everything else would crumble. And you could not make an argument for logic without using logic. And that would be the ultimate circularity.
Right. Exactly. That's why everything I say is not truth. That's why it's so hard, right? Because we're used to trying to have these debates to determine things. Yeah. And that's not the best way to know, right? The best way to know is simply silence, right? Ramana Maharshi, that's why he taught in silence. He was silent all the time unless someone really, really begged him to speak to him, right?
Who's that, sorry?
Ramana Maharshi, he is I believe he's a great Indian sage, right? Someone who has been known by that culture to have known God directly. So much so, I mean, from a very young age too. Really an incredible story if you look up Ramana Maharshi, but he's kind of this ancient guru. But the ultimate teacher is really silence. The ultimate teacher goes beyond logic and rationality. Of course, you can't just do that to someone who has never experienced any sort of knowing beyond the conceptual mind. You have to kind of inch them in the right direction with the right sort of concepts, right? But you'll find, like, as you go deep enough into this logic and rationality, it just becomes circular. It becomes this giant contradiction, this giant paradox. And you either accept that and push a little deeper, or you just have to admit that you can't know. And that's what most people do, is they just admit, well, that's as far as logic and rationality goes, so I can't know, right?
Yeah, once again, this idea of the fitra in Islam is something which we could even term supra-rational. So it's something that is aside from the rational. In fact, there's an entire kind of story or narrative in Islam about how this came about, which is mentioned in the 7th chapter, I believe in the 100 and maybe 70th verse, I'm not sure where it is exactly, but of the Quran, where it says that God took, basically all of the souls of humankind were in front of God, and that he had this interaction with them, and he said, Alastu bi rabbikum, am I not your Lord? So he had this kind of question answer interaction. Qalu bala shahidna, and then they said, yes, we bear testimony to that. In other words, every single soul of every single human being has the, metaphorically speaking here, the signature of God in it. And this is the term of René Descartes, the signature, the autograph. He said the autograph of God in it. Every single soul of the human being, your soul, my soul, everyone's soul. So that when such soul is put back into the body through the ensoulment period, say after 40 days of it being in the womb of the mother, we believe, that what happens is human being is born in this state of consciousness of God. And all they require is reminder. And that's why the Quran is actually referred to as a dhikr, the reminder, because it awakens that reset, that fitra, or that disposition that we originally had. The idea of Islam is not necessarily just to give demonstrable proofs or cosmological argument or fine tuning argument, and those are good as well. We can speak about them as well. But what we believe is one of the most self-evident ways of proving God's existence is the experience. And so the Quran, when it's coming now to remind humankind, it refers to itself as dhikr, or the reminder. So it's trying to jog your memory, if you like.
Yeah.
Have it in there that you believe in a higher power and a creator and so on. The Quran's job is to jog your memory and to remind you of your initial purpose, your teleos. And your teleos, or your original purpose, is that you may worship or submit to God. And that is the way you will be. Some people say we want to be one with nature. You know, this is, you'll find a lot in Eastern tradition, that the idea of being synchronized with nature, and this is where nirvana will be achieved, or something like this. The Islamic conception is that the only way to be one with nature is to do what everything in nature is doing, which is submitting to the laws of God. And one thing that God gave us, we believe, which is different from the rest of the objects in nature, is he gave us free will. So whereas an angel, or let's say even celestial objects and spheres, they have no choice but to submit to the laws of God. God distinguished human being by giving them this intuition of free will, where we seem like we have this decision to make, and then reminds that individual with their purpose and calls them to that purpose, such that if they come to that purpose, they will be higher than everything else in creation, even the angels, or even the objects in space and so on, because all of those objects in space and nature, they haven't had to make a decision, or they haven't used their free will or volition in order to come to a conclusion of God and worshiping God, and so on. whereas human being has. And so he is elevated above and beyond the status of all of those existences in the world, whether it's inanimate or animate or wherever it may be, that have no choice but to submit themselves to the power and will of God, we believe. So the crux here is, if one remembers what their purpose is and their calling is in life and responds to that calling, then they become the believers that are illuminated with the light of God. And if one decides to cover themselves with illusion and delusion and doubt, then they become those who are trying to ignore the calling of God.
I agree. Yeah, 100%. Yeah, I believe that most people are caught in this illusion, and there's something that's trying to get them to remember. I love it. I've never heard of that before. What was that called? You had like a word for it, this remembering?
Yeah. So the initial state is called the Fitra. It's an Arabic word meaning literally the disposition, the innate predisposition. And then the Quran refers to as the dhikr, or the remembrance. So it's kind of like, and this is beautiful in the Quran, by the way. And there's one verse in the Quran which is one of the most powerful verses of the Quran, which is in chapter 24 of the Quran. And the verse, let me just read it out for you, because I think it'll be. Let me get it for you quickly. I don't want to get this wrong. All right. It's in chapter 24 and verse 35. Okay, so let me read it out for you. I think you enjoy it, because
okay, cool.
This is one of this is a verse that many commentators have spent their whole lives kind of trying to study. It says, Allahu nuru samawati wal ard. Allah is the light of the heavens and the earth. The parable of his light is as if there were a niche, and within it a lamp. The lamp is in a glass. The glass as it were a brilliant star, lit from a blessed tree, an olive, neither of the east nor of the west. Gets its sun rays only in the afternoon, but it's exposed to the sun all day long, whose oil would almost glow forth of itself, though no fire has touched it. Light upon light. Allah guides to his light whom he wills, and Allah sets forth parables for mankind, and Allah is the all-knower of everything. The idea here, مثل نوره كمشكات. This niche, a lot of scholars have said this, it's like a niche, it's like a lamp inside it, is the human heart. So we're talking about the heart now, which is protected with the ribs and is illuminating with light. And that God is also light. And that there is an interactivity between the light that we all have inside of us and the light who is God. And when God sends forth his revelation, it becomes light upon light. So it's this combination, this compounded light.
Yeah.
And this is the experience we as Muslims, we should be feeling. I mean, and it's called, there's actually a phenomenon referred to as halawat al-iman, which is the sweetness of faith. When you are in this spiritual state where you're really connecting with God and you are really calling for God or yearning for him or prostrating to him, because prostration is one of the most powerful positions from the Muslim perspective. This phenomenon of halawat al-iman, or the sweetness of iman, it becomes expounded, and it compounds to the point where you literally can almost, you were talking about tasting the apple, you can almost taste, if you want to call it the apple yourself, you can taste it. It's literally sweet. There's a sweetness to it. And this can only be achieved through real submission, pure submission, knowing your place in the universe and knowing what your place in conjunction with the creator of the universe. And so in that sense, it's a first person subjective experience, but it's a very, very powerful experience. And one that in many ways, although it's not demonstrable in the same way as maybe one of the arguments, the fine tuning, the kalam or the contingency argument, or, the arguments from prophethood or whatever, this is a way where you can directly have an interactivity with God, where you know that there is a connection. Just like if you call somebody now, maybe your friend or your partner or whoever, and you speak to them, you know they're on the other side, although they're not physically there. When we're in the prayer and we're prostrating and we're bowing and all of these things, or repenting, even coming back to God after we've committed sin, whatever it may be, this is that kind of connection. Actually, the word salah comes from the Arabic word sila, which means connection. So it's like we have a WhatsApp connection with God through the prayer, or you know, Telegram, WhatsApp, social media. So, but instead we have that connection with God.
I love it. That's awesome. I think that the world would be a much better place when people focus on these direct experiences rather than these clashing beliefs, you know? So
yeah, I get your point,
awesome.
man. Yeah.
I love it. I love it. That's awesome. So I do have an interesting question though. So
yeah,
you have this, right? There still is a separation, right? Between you, right? And then God. So this might be a difficult question, but what are you? You know what I mean? Like, how do you define yourself, right? Like what you are, what is your sense of self?
So from the Islamic perspective, we are a combination of things. A lot of people just say it's duality or dualism. They say, like, a lot of the Islamic philosophers have said it's mind-body dualism. But the truth is, it's much more complex than that. So we believe that we're a body. Yes, we believe in the body. We believe in the mind. Now, where is the mind? Is it just in the brain? We don't believe it's just in the brain, for sure. We believe that there's a first-person subjective experience there. There must be some kind of connection between the heart, the actual physical lump inside of your chest, which, by the way, quite interestingly, recently they've discovered in this Heart Math Institute, they discovered something called the little brain in the heart or something like this in the 80s. They were writing peer-reviewed journals and stuff, talking about how the heart itself has neurons and the capacity to kind of...
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
You might have come across this yourself.
Oh, yeah, real quick. It's really interesting. So they've done studies, right? When they do like heart transplants, there's so many interesting stories. They'll do a heart transplant and the person that got the new heart will start behaving like the person that they got the transplant from. It's incredible. There's not just this massive intelligence in our brain, but this massive intelligence, especially in our heart, but really just everywhere in our whole body. It's the mind and body are one, and it's very beautiful, for sure.
Absolutely. And you know, there is something called heart blindness in the Islamic understanding, based on this understanding of the verse where it says that, you know, it's not the eyes that go blind, it's the hearts within the chest that go. So there is a, if you want to even call it cognition, but it's not just cognition, it's a presence, it's a conscientiousness of the heart. So it's an interactivity of the brain, yes, but the brain and the heart and the soul and all of it comes together in a perfect harmony. It's like a show almost, like, you know, it's all coming together and it's interacting. It's not just a dualism of mind body. No, it's much more complex than that. And when you're in a state of meditation, okay, when you're in a state of, we believe, oneness with God, and where you call in God and you're asking him for guidance and so on, all of these things kind of come together. They congregate in submission to the ultimate light, which is, we believe God is Nur Samawati wal Ard, literally, as the verse says, that he is the light of the heavens and the earth. And his light is metaphoric, but in this verse, but it's also something which is in many ways literal as well. So, something which is powerful and which goes straight to the heart.
I love it. Wow. Yeah. That's beautiful. Yeah, that's awesome. I love it. You know, it seems like such a deeper experience than most people are used to, you know, at least most people in my culture, right? The culture of the Trinity, you know, it's all in their mind. That's it. They can't get out of their mind. That's everything, right? I mean, geez, the hustle and bustle of society, the stress, the anxiety, everyone's caught in their mind, right? And they couldn't even fathom some sort of experience like that, where this intelligence lines up in the whole body, not just the mind, right? That's such an interesting experience that most people could not even fathom, is some sort of cognition that's beyond the brain, right? That's in the scientific community. It's like, that's it. The brain houses everything.
Yes.
Right? It houses everything. Here's the interesting analogy that I like to make, right? Because there has to be some sort of intelligence beyond the body, some intelligence that actually gives rise to the body. Think about a dream, right? When you're in a dream, your mind is creating the entire dream, right? Everyone will admit that. Your mind's creating the dream. You don't know how it's creating the dream, right? But your subconscious mind is creating the entire dream. And you understand this when you become lucid in the dream. Now, the scientific community
This
will
is the
say,
second or
"Oh,
third time you mentioned lucid dreams. I mean, it's something that you're into.
oh yeah, absolutely, man. Lucid dreams are great. I mean, I think lucid dreaming is a great way to kind of get in touch with reality as well, and kind of realize the similarities between like dreaming and reality, right? That it's not just some physical process, you know?
Yeah.
And so when you become lucid in the dream, you realize that the whole mind is creating the dream. And scientists will say, oh, well, all of that is just happening within the brain, but not the dream brain. Does that make sense? So if you're sitting in a dream and you reach inside and feel your brain, that brain that you're feeling in the dream is not creating the entire dream, right? So with that same analogy, and of course you could argue that dreams are different from reality, blah, 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 but it's interesting to think about, well, what if this brain, right, is not creating this reality, right? God is creating this reality, and the brain is just an experience of reality. It's an appearance in reality. And of course it has its place, right? Because the earth is, and the universe is physical, but also not physical, right? There's this interesting...
So you're kind of alluding to solipsism. I'm not sure if you've come across this idea of the brain and a vat.
Right. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
I know what solipsism is. Absolutely. Yeah. I guess I wouldn't say I'm alluding to that per se. Right. Now, of course, you can't really argue against it. It depends
it's
upon
impossible
how you define
to
solipsism,
defeat.
right? It's nothing. You could never experience anything beyond solipsism. I like thinking of solipsism not as a truth or untruth, but as a description of your reality, right? And you'll find that, I think the deeper you go, you realize that it can't be really solipsism nor not solipsism, right? It's solipsism on the one case because your direct experience is all that you'll ever have, right? And of course, that's what it is. But yet, there's this incredible complexity of other minds, and those minds are, you can experience those minds being just as real as you. Even if they're in your mind, they're still a different mind, right? Like that other mind still exists, even if it's part of your mind. And then you'll start getting into, wow, it's kind of all one mind, right? It's the mind of God, right? And there's this...
I mean, here's what we would say, like in terms of, there's actually, we've got a theology of this. And in terms of sleeping, I think, and dreaming is really powerful. It's a really powerful way. I mean, Freud himself has written a book on dreams, but he obviously attributes it to he has this thing of the id ego and the super ego, and he attributes it to the unconscious mind. And that's why it's part of his hypnosis and free association and so on. But in the Islamic understanding, although that does have something to play, I mean, the unconscious mind is one of the reasons why we have dreams. And in fact, there's a hadith that goes to that effect. There's something else, which is the fact that when human beings lose consciousness and they fall asleep, from the Islamic perspective, they literally, the soul leaves their body at that point. The soul leaves their body. They're detached from their body. So the state of unconsciousness is a state which is categorized or characterized, from the Islamic perspective as the leaving of the soul from the body. And so that is why the Prophet said that basically sleep is the brother of death. Because when you're sleeping and when you're dying, the same process is effectively taking place, but in two different ways. When you're sleeping, the process is that your soul comes out of your body and then it comes back in effectively when you regain consciousness, even if you sleep for a very short period of time. When you're dying, the same exact thing happens, but the only thing is that your body decays for a long time because your soul is suspended from the body. And then from the Islamic perspective, once again, it is reunited with the body, but in the day of judgment. So there's a longer transition period. But the same state is the same. So even from a scientific perspective, you say this, we can say, or especially with consideration to the first person subjective experiences that we have, when we do sleep, we lose consciousness. When we lose consciousness, we have experienced dreams. When we experience dreams, how real are these dreams? I mean, I've experienced this kind of hallucination dreams, which I feel like I'm in a place. I don't know if you've taken this. A lot of people talk about psychedelics nowadays. I'm not sure if you've have you tried that?
Of course, I've done my fair share.
I've never done it.
Really?
Maybe I'll ask you about that because, to be honest, just the other day, just like 3 or 4 days ago, I've never had any recreational drugs in my life. Yeah, honestly.
Wow.
Yeah. No, I've never had drinking or any intoxication, anything like, because it's not allowed in the religion. That's why I've never done it in my 29 years. But the other day, honestly, like 2 weeks ago, I was sleeping, but honestly, it felt like I was, I'll tell you what's happening. Like the stars were falling on me. The stars were falling on me. Like I felt like it was real. I honestly felt, and then I woke up and I was like, whoa, man, was that real or not? Like I didn't even know the difference. Where am
Yeah.
I? What reality am I in? Right?
Exactly.
It was. I don't know if psychedelics make you feel like that, because Joe Rogan keeps talking about in his podcast. Does it make you feel like that?
You can't even put it into a category like that, right? Depending on how much you do and which kinds, and even what spiritual state that you're in, it can be, it's indescribable, right? You can have experiences that are beyond the conceptual mind, that are impossible to.
Yes.
Yeah.
Is it kind of like what I'm describing?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, for sure, right?
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
for sure. But of course, it can go even deeper than that, right? It can get absolutely insane, right? And
so, what's your number one experience with it? Sorry, just to
it gets crazy, man. It gets so crazy. I mean, one of my first ever experiences, one of my big breakthrough experiences on psychedelics was this substance known as ayahuasca. Have you heard of ayahuasca?
No.
Okay, ayahuasca. The substance is called DMT, dimethyltryptamine. Have you heard of that?
Yeah. I've heard of DMT.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's the oral version of dimethyltryptamine. You have to take it with a monoamine oxidase, I believe monoamine oxidase inhibitor, right?
So all of these are hallucinogens, yeah? Hallucinogenic
yeah,
stuff.
For sure. Yeah. Now I have an interesting concept about hallucinations, right? Because from a first person perspective, essentially
right.
everything is just like a hallucination, right?
Yeah, good point. Yeah.
But so the craziest experience I really had was some sort of weird, you can't really call it reincarnation, because I came back in the same body, right? Yeah. But essentially an absolute, complete, utter ego death, right? Where I became absolute nothingness. Okay. So no thoughts, no recollection of who I was, just infinite presence. And then I was all of a sudden, this was in nowhere, right? And then all of a sudden I come back and I'm in my body, but I'm in my body experiencing the world as if I were a baby, right? Whoa. So I actually had the experience of being a baby and looking at the world. I was looking up at the stars and at this beautiful scenery in the desert, but I had no recollection of what anything is.
And how real did that feel? How real did that feel for you?
Oh, no, this is the thing. So it's realer than real, right? This is why people who have had these experiences can't call them hallucinations, because it makes this feel like a hallucination. It's essentially it's like you're in 2D, okay? Imagine your whole life is in 2D, and then all of a sudden you experience 3D. Well, how can you say that the 3D is a hallucination? No. It's like, whoa, no. The 2D is just a finite abstraction of this 3D, right?
Get your point. So it feels more real than what you're going through now.
Oh yeah, absolutely. And it was incredible. It felt like all of a sudden I was this just blank slate of a purely blank mind. And then all my memories started flowing in. For me, I wouldn't know. I could have been born on that day and I wouldn't have known, right? That day, I could have just had all my memories and ideas of the past and my sense of self come to me right then. And I wouldn't know the difference, right? That could have been the day that like the universe was created, like I wouldn't know any difference. Mm-hmm. And so that was really the most profound experience, I would say. Mm-hmm. And then I've had, many since then that that is like the deepest that I can explain with words. Okay. So that's the one that you can conceptualize that kind of, but there are other ones that are just so beyond concept that it wouldn't even make sense to talk about. Right. But man, I mean, of course, like
this is the idea. So from the Islamic paradigm, there's a way of explaining all of this. So the soul is what's going through all these experiences. Right. So obviously on a materialist or naturalistic approach, a physicalist approach, they say it's all the brain, and they'll give you MRI scans of how your brain kind of interacts, and when it's on DMT, for example, how it kind of activates compared to when it's not on DMT, for instance. And they'll say, look, everything is fired up, and it looks like everything is fired up, and they'll explain it like that. But for us, that's a very insignificant kind of, it's not a good explanation. Mm-hmm. Because for us, we believe that there's a soul in the human being. And the way to explain these experiences, whether you're sleeping or whether you're having one of your DMT experiences or psychedelic drugs, all of it is the same thing. The soul is literally, it comes out of the body, and it goes to a place which we refer to as al-barzakh, which is exactly the same place where it goes when it dies. Basically, when you die, you will not just cease being.
Right.
The soul will go to another place, and it will experience a reality, just like you've just said that you've experienced a reality that, in your words, was more real than what we're going through now. In
Right.
in many ways, this reality that you're going to go through is an objective reality, which will be as real as what we're talking about right now.
Yeah.
And it will be one where literally you're confronted with your actions. Whether
Mm.
you have been a good person, you'll be confronted with that, and the angels will come once again, interrogating you. What did you believe in, and this and that, and what you a good person or a bad person? And there will be an entire kind of thing that will take place before what we refer to as the day of judgment takes place. So I think when this whole thing of psychedelics has opened up to people the possibilities of the soul being a reality, because they're not convinced. A lot of people are becoming less and less convinced with these physicalist interpretations as all the brain, because they know
Right.
that this is something which is deeper than that.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Mhm.
I think it goes even deeper than that. I don't think it's one way or the other. I think this is the brilliance of reality, is that it's really impossible to understand with the conceptual mind, but it has, you know what a strange loop is? Essentially, it's sort of this hierarchical structure where, you know, it could be an object that's both like inside and outside at the same time, or it's kind of like a hierarchical structure where A is greater than B is greater than C is greater than A. And so like the Penrose triangle is an idea of a strange loop, and that can't really exist in like the 3D world, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. And essentially reality, you'll find that reality is this type of strange loop where not only is the universe in the brain, but the brain is also in the universe, right? It's not really like one or the other. It's this incredible singularity of presence and oneness that's really, really interesting. But the thing is that it helps for people to see the entire coin. They first need to see the other side of the coin, and then they can see the whole coin. So most people will just see this as this physical universe. So it helps them to talk about the perspective of this being some sort of mental creation. And then the next level is just, it kind of comes all together and you realize it's really both. And that's the beauty behind it, right? It's actually this perfect design that is so powerful and so infinite that it's just impossible to really comprehend with the normal human mind.
Well, it's very powerful what you've said, and I think you've opened up a lot of our horizons and given us a lot of insights. And look, it's been a pleasure having you on this podcast. If any time you want to come and ask us any questions, you can. And I'm going to be sending you a couple of things over to, if you just send me your email or something like that, I'll send you some materials, some of the books that we've written, some of the materials that, like the Quran, you can read, a translation that one of my friends had just completed, Mustafa Khattab, and other things that hopefully will be of use to you. But have you got any like questions before we go, or anything that you were wondering?
No, I think that's pretty much it, man. I really enjoyed the conversation. It was just an awesome conversation. I love talking about this
and
stuff.
it's refreshing to see people that now, like, I think a lot of people now are moving away from like the whole new atheist, materialist kind of. It's not satisfying people, and
No, absolutely not.
yeah, and I think that you're definitely on the right tracks, man. It's refreshing to have these kinds of conversations with people that go beyond the like standard evidences, new atheist jargon and stuff like that, man.
Exactly. You realize that stuff is limited, man. So yeah, I love it. Hopefully, I think your followers are going to be much more open to this than mine. Mine are still, I changed my content recently. So it's tough trying to explain these concepts to such egoic materialists. I used to be a fitness dude who just like worked out and was all about like the body and stuff like that. And that's who my fans are. So it'll be awesome to have someone who has this like authority that you do in the more like spiritual realm, right?
Believe me, I don't have any authority at all.
Yeah,
my followers don't give me any authority like that, man.
Really? Oh, they should, man. They should. Yeah, you're a great intellectual, man. You talk about this stuff in a really articulate way that I really appreciate. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, man. I think that definitely when you have a dance partner like you, it's always going to be easier, isn't it? And it's good that, like, obviously, you gave us like this whole psychedelic thing. I've always actually wanted to ask someone about it because I've never had the opportunity to do that before, man.
Oh yeah, man. Of course, I definitely recommend it. It's just you need to combine it with spirituality. People will do psychedelics and just do it to do it. It's not like that, right? It's essentially the same thing as taking some sort of anabolic steroid when without working out at all.
Have you done that before as well?
I actually haven't. That's the thing. I actually
haven't cycled yourself, huh?
Yeah, no one believes me about that, but I actually haven't. I used to be a lot bigger. I used to be very obsessive about working out, but now I found a balance. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. All right, well, it's been a pleasure.
Yeah, of course, man.
And anytime, our house is your house, man, as they say.
Awesome. Sounds good.
All right, man. Hopefully we're going to put this up, and you can take any part of it you want and put it on your channel as well, man.
Cool. So that's probably the best idea, is just to take one segment, maybe a few minutes, and just promote your podcast.
Yeah. Fantastic. Okay. Thanks so much, man.
Yeah, of course. Where can I find your podcast to get put the
It'll
link
be
in?
on my channel, on my YouTube channel.
Okay, perfect. Yeah, awesome.
Yeah.
So this video will be on your channel.
Yeah, for sure.
Awesome. Hell yeah.
Right,
sweet. I appreciate it, man. Thank you so much for having me.
Appreciate you, man. See you later, man. Take care, man.